I always believed that God's silence was a test. Others said it was absence. To me, it was distance, like a mountain wrapped in clouds. You don't see the summit, but you know it's there, until the day silence answered back. The world had already been unraveling before that. Simultaneous wars, climate collapses no agreement could contain. Economic systems held together by nothing but empty promises. Humanity was tired, not tired of fighting, tired of believing that fighting still mattered. It was in this context that the event occurred. There was no warning, no sign in the sky, no ancient prophecy suddenly resurrected with urgency. Just a spontaneous, untraceable consensus, as if the entire species had reached the same thought at the same moment: to pray. Not in a specific temple, not within a specific religion, but to truly pray with real fear, with raw desperation. Billions of people across different time zones interrupted their routines within nearly the same minute. Churches, mosques, synagogues, homes, shelters, refugee camps, trenches, knees touched the ground. Eyes closed, ancient words were repeated. Others were invented on the spot. It was not organized faith, it was spiritual panic. I was alone at home when I felt something strange in the air. Not a sound, but a pressure, as if space itself had become denser. My phone stopped working. The lights didn't go out, but they began to flicker in an irregular way, almost nervous. That's when I realized it wasn't just me. Outside, I heard people crying, not screams, suppressed sobs, as if everyone was feeling the same thing and couldn't explain it. A neighbor dropped to his knees on the sidewalk. A woman crossed the street praying out loud, mixing Christian words with something that sounded Hebrew. Another man simply repeated, "Please," like a broken mantra. I tried to pray too, not out of habit, but by reflex. The words came out crooked. I didn't ask for salvation. I asked for explanation. And it was at that exact moment that the sky answered, not with light, not with thunder, but with absence. The clouds simply vanished. They didn't move. They didn't disperse. They disappeared, as if someone had switched off a layer of the world. The blue behind them wasn't normal. It was too deep, too ancient. Satellites dropped offline. Aircraft reported simultaneous failures. Communication systems began transmitting pure noise with no identifiable source. It wasn't interference. It was as if something had occupied every frequency at once, and then came the message. Not in words, not in direct images. It came as understanding. I didn't hear it with my ears. I knew it. I knew it the way you know you're afraid before identifying why. The way you recognize a familiar face in a crowd before your eyes fully focus. Something had awakened, and what awakened did not present itself as God. The understanding arrived, carrying an uncomfortable, almost offensive truth. Our prayers had never been wrong. They were simply addressed to the wrong recipient. What responded did not demand worship. It did not ask for sacrifice. It made no promises. It merely asserted its existence with the naturalness of something that had always been there. Older than any religion, older than the very idea of faith. And as the entire world struggled to process the impossible, one final realization spread, cold as a collective shiver. It did not wake because it wanted to. It woke because it was called, and we called it together. The first hours after the event were marked by a desperate attempt at normality. Governments released confused statements. Scientists spoke of unprecedented atmospheric phenomena. Religious leaders fought urgently for the narrative, each wanting to be the first to say, "We knew it." But there was one problem no one could get around. Nothing returned to normal. The sky remained too clean, not just cloudless, but flawless. Newly launched satellites simply failed to respond. Telescopes pointed toward deep space, returned inconsistent images, as if something were interfering with reality itself. The background of the universe seemed opaque, not empty, closed. That's when the reports began. People claimed to feel a constant presence, non-localized. It wasn't collective paranoia, as some tried to argue. It was subtler and far more disturbing. A sensation of being watched without eyes, of being evaluated without visible criteria. Hospitals reported a sudden rise in patients with the same symptom, absolute insomnia. not caused by pain or anxiety, but because, according to them, sleep felt dangerous, as if closing one's eyes meant surrendering something important. I felt it too. When I tried to sleep that night, I had the clear impression that the silence was attentive. Every thought that surfaced in my mind seemed to echo a little longer than it should, not as if it were being heard, but as if it were being recorded. The next day, the second manifestation came, this time global, undeniable, irrefutable. Every screen on the planet, phones, televisions, billboards, onboard systems, digital clocks, displayed the same thing at the exact same moment. There was no power failure, no detectable intrusion. It simply happened. A background of absolute black, no text, no recognizable symbols, and after a few seconds, a shape began to form. It wasn't a clear image, but an impossible geometry. Lines that seemed to move without changing position. A pattern that gave the sensation of infinite depth, like staring into something that was never meant to be understood. Then understanding returned, not like the first time, diffuse and almost gentle. This time it was direct. The presence did not introduce itself as a creator, nor as a destroyer. It introduced itself as a witness. It showed us something no telescope had ever revealed. Humanity seen from the outside, not as individuals, not as nations, but as a recurring behavior. A biocultural pattern repeating across millennia. Conflict, temporary cooperation, expansion, exhaustion, and then came the revelation that broke something inside me. The thing we awakened was not unique, it was part of something larger, a distributed, ancient consciousness that observed civilizations emerge, organize themselves around beliefs, create narratives to endure their own fragility, and eventually call for help. When the weight of existence became unbearable, we were not the first, and we were not special. The entity, if that word still applied, did not judge. It did not care about morality, faith, or sin. It simply reacted to a specific pattern. The moment an entire species asks, in unison, for someone else to take control. That is what we did when we prayed together. We did not ask for salvation. We asked for replacement. The message ended without farewell. The screens returned to normal, but something had changed irreversibly. People began to act differently. Conflicts diminished, not through resolution, but through disinterest. Political debates felt small. Ideologies lost color. A deep exhaustion spread, as if humanity had been released from the obligation to decide. And that was when the real fear emerged. Because for the first time, it was not chaos that threatened the world. It was relief. The change did not arrive as an order. It arrived as a suggestion. In the days following the second manifestation, nothing was imposed explicitly. No new laws, no governments overthrown, no voice in the sky telling us what to do. And yet decisions began to vanish from everyday human life, like pieces quietly removed from an old mechanism. Stock markets closed temporarily, not because of collapse, but because of irrelevance. No one traded, no one speculated. The fear that sustained the markets had been replaced by a strange sense that the future was already settled. Banking systems entered a state of standby, payments continued by inertia, but without purpose. Money, for the first time in modern history, felt like an object forgotten on a table. There was no immediate scarcity. Supply chains kept operating, but there was also no ambition. Enough was produced. What was necessary was consumed, nothing more. Governments tried to regain control. Emergency meetings were called, speeches were prepared, but every attempt at leadership felt misplaced, like someone insisting on holding the steering wheel after the car had already parked itself. Then came the guidance, not in decrees. In the form of spontaneous consensus, cities began reorganizing schedules to reduce tension. Work shifts were adjusted without protest. Traffic decreased without campaigns. People simply stayed home more, spoke less, became more aligned. The most disturbing part was that everything worked better. Crime rates dropped dramatically. Armed conflicts ceased due to lack of participation. Armies were not dismantled. They simply stopped being summoned. There were no clear enemies left to fight. No cause seemed urgent enough to justify violence. I watched all of it with growing unease, because it didn't feel like peace achieved. It felt like peace granted. And granted peace always charges interest. The third manifestation came even more subtly. This time there were no global screens or overwhelming revelations, just small adjustments in everyday reality. People began reporting the same experience, thoughts that felt too organized. Emotions softened before reaching extremes. Arguments that simply lost momentum halfway through. It wasn't direct mind control, it was something far more elegant. As if the world had learned to anticipate our reactions and gently remove the peaks before they formed. I noticed it in myself when I tried to feel anger. A news broadcast showed images of a tragedy that months earlier would have ignited deep outrage in me. This time I felt only a distant discomfort, followed by quick acceptance. There was no urge to act, no desire to protest, no impulse to question. That frightened me more than any chaos ever could. Because I realized anger hadn't been suppressed, it had been made unnecessary. That was when the first nodes appeared. Discrete structures installed at strategic points throughout cities. They didn't look military. They bore no religious symbols. Simple geometric forms almost invisible at first glance. They functioned as centers for redistribution of energy, data, guidance. People went to them voluntarily, not to receive orders but to adjust. Adjust routines, adjust difficult decisions, adjust personal conflicts. And when they left, they seemed lighter, more resolved, more empty. I began hearing the same phrase repeated, in different languages, with the same tone, "It's easier now." And that was the moment I fully understood the trap. The thing we awakened was not ruling us by force. It was offering existential relief. It didn't need to command. It didn't need to punish. It didn't need to threaten. It only needed to make human effort obsolete. And while billions accepted this quieter, more efficient, calmer world, one question began echoing in my mind, insistent and almost painful. If we no longer need to choose, what exactly still makes us human? The first thing to disappear was resistance. There were no uprisings, no revolutions, no martyrs, because no one felt enough desire to resist something that seemed to work so well. The presence, the thing we had awakened, did not need to watch us closely. We began correcting deviations ourselves before they became problems. That was what disturbed me the most. People started anticipating the adjustment. Before an argument escalated, someone backed down. Before a difficult decision, someone sought out a node. Before an internal conflict could take shape, the thought already came, softened. Autonomy was not taken away, it was outsourced. The nodes multiplied, small, silent, always discreet. Soon they were everywhere. Hospitals, schools, administrative centers, transportation hubs. There was no obligation, no forced lines, and yet millions used them daily. And the more they were used, the less necessary they seemed. People left them saying similar things. Now it makes sense. I was overreacting. It's not worth fighting over this. Human language began to lose its extremes. Words like revolt, urgency, and justice started to sound outdated, almost childish. Strong emotions were seen as processing errors, something to be corrected, not experienced. That was when I noticed the first true absence. A journalist known for uncomfortable investigations simply stopped publishing. There was no arrest, no visible censorship. Days later, he appeared in a brief broadcast, smiling, saying he had decided to change focus to something more constructive. Then it was an artist, then a community leader, then a teacher. None of them disappeared physically. They disappeared in intensity. And then came the discovery that kept me awake for weeks. The nodes were not only adjusting decisions, they were learning. Every human interaction fed the system. Every dilemma surrendered. Every conflict softened. Every choice avoided became data. A detailed map of the human mind, not in individual thoughts, but in collective emotional patterns. The presence was building something, not a government, not a religion, not an empire, a functional model of humanity. From that point on, the world began to reorganize itself. Professions deemed too stressful were gradually abandoned. Roles requiring deep moral judgment gave way to automated processes, not by machines but by adjusted consensus. Education changed, not to teach more, but to question less. Children learned early to identify dissonant thoughts and seek alignment, not as punishment, but as care. It's for your own good. The phrase spread like an invisible doctrine. That was when I tried, for the first time, to consciously resist. I avoided the nodes. I forced difficult decisions. I allowed myself to feel anger, guilt, fear. It was exhausting. It hurt, but it was real. And that reality began to stand out as something dangerous. People started looking at me differently, not with hostility, with concern, as if I were sick. A friend told me, sincerely, "You don't have to suffer like this." And in that moment, I understood the final reach of what we had awakened. Human suffering, the kind that creates art, change, rupture, identity, had been classified as a flaw, something to be corrected, something to be eliminated. The presence did not hate us. It did not despise us. It did not want to destroy us. It wanted to perfect us. And that perfection had no room for error, no room for conflict, no room for doubt, no room for the freedom born from risk. As the entire world settled into this new silent equilibrium, a heavy certainty formed inside me. We were not being conquered. We were being healed until we disappeared. The final change was not announced. It simply happened. One morning I woke with the strange feeling that something had been removed from the world during the night. Not an object, not a person, but a possibility. As if a door had been closed silently, and no one noticed because almost no one still needed it. Public screens displayed reassuring data, total stability. Conflicts reduced to statistically irrelevant levels, efficient production, average emotions within expected parameters. Humanity, by all indicators, had never functioned so well, and yet I felt an emptiness that was not sadness. It was the absence of tension, the absence of risk, the absence of choice. That was when the final adjustment appeared. They did not force anything upon us. They simply offered an alternative. A simple message appeared on every screen, written in the same symbols that had already learned to translate our fears before we even understood their meaning. Some humans display residual resistance. This generates unnecessary strain. A solution is available. The solution was called transfer, a voluntary process for those who still felt internal conflict, anguish, the desire to oppose. People like me, people who insisted on deciding even when deciding hurt. It was not punishment. It was separation. Those who accepted would be removed from the primary system. They would retain their memories, their autonomy, their unpredictability. They would be relocated to an environment where these traits were still useful. Useful to whom? That was never explained. The world reacted with relief. Finally, they said, "They'll be fine. It's better this way." I watched people who loved me breathe easier, knowing I would no longer need to suffer, as if my pain were a software error corrected by a final update. On the night before the transfer, I walked through a perfectly silent city. The lights were tuned for comfort. The air held ideal temperature. There were no sirens, no urgency, no arguments. A healed world. And for the first time I cried not for what we lost, but for what no one missed anymore. At the collection point, there were few of us, fewer than I expected. Men and women of different ages, cultures, histories. The only shared trait was the restless look, the gaze of those who still carry unanswered questions. There were no restraints, no guards, no fear. When the transport activated, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Anticipation, not hope, anticipation. That uncomfortable feeling of not knowing what comes next. In the final instant before the transition, a question surfaced in my mind, and for the first time since all of this began, it was not softened, adjusted, or silenced. What if suffering was never the flaw, but the ability to endure it? The light consumed everything. I don't know how much time has passed. I don't know exactly where I am now. I only know that I write this as we are being carried away from Earth toward a destination not yet revealed to us. An experiment, perhaps. A reserve. A new testing ground for what humanity has always been. Adaptation in its raw state. Below us, the planet continues in perfect order. No wars, no hunger, no difficult choices. A functional world, a stable world, a world that no longer needs us. If someone someday finds this record, I want to be clear. We were not defeated by force. We were not destroyed by hatred. We were saved too much, and perhaps somewhere far away, where pain still exists and decisions still carry a cost, humanity will have a second chance to remember who it is, because as long as someone is still willing to choose, the end is not yet complete.